Father Abraham. We are picking up the story of the Old Testament this week with Abraham and Sarah, with Hagar and Ishmael. May the Lord be with you. This is Pastor Ryan over here at St. Peter's, and this is part of our video series, Confirmation Cliffs Notes. The idea is that if there is a confirmation student or family who cannot make it to our lectures and conversations on the first and third Sundays of each month, this is a way to help catch up. Obviously, this is going to be shorter than the hour that we have together here in the fellowship hall, but it is certainly better than missing the topic altogether. So, to this point in our syllabus, we have talked about what I've referred to as the mythic beginnings of the Hebrew Bible: creation, the fall, and the flood. And of course, when we talk about myths, we don't mean to say that these stories are fictional or that they never happened, but a myth is a story that makes sense of our world. A myth tells us deep truths about God, the universe, and humanity's relationship to both. And in that sense, the stories of Genesis 1 and 2, while they do not agree in every detail, nonetheless, they agree in substance, which is that God is eternal and created all things. The world was made good, and that people are important and loved and have dignity simply by dint of being human. And of course, we have the responsibility to steward and care for all that God has made. That's the message of the early chapters of Genesis. When we look at a myth, we should be able to put ourselves in the shoes of the characters, right? You are Adam. You are Eve. Sometimes maybe you're even the serpent. A myth is a story that never was and always is, as the old saying goes. It's one that imparts eternal truths, more than just historical. Now that said, we are transitioning into a part of the biblical story that is intended to be more historical. We're moving from mythic time into the world as we know it with the story of Sarah and Abraham. So we start off in Genesis chapter 11, verse 31, and we read 11:31 through chapter 12, verse 7. We are introduced to Father Abraham, who at the time of his introduction into the text is 75 years old, which is a pretty good age for someone to have reached more than 4,000 years ago. I mean, the time of Abraham, we're looking at something like 2200 BC, and to reach 75 years old was not utterly unheard of, but was certainly an accomplishment when so many people unfortunately died young. So Abraham is, by the standards of his own day, a terrifically old man, and his wife, Abram, I should say, is his name at this point, and his wife, Sarai, is barren. She's gone through menopause. They did not have any children, and now they cannot have any children. But God comes to Abram and Sarai and gives them a remarkable promise, an impossible promise. He says that of you two, of a man as good as dead and a barren wife, God will make a family. That family will become a people. That people will become a nation. And through that nation, God will bless all the families of the earth. On the one hand, this is a very specific promise to a very specific couple. On the other hand, it is a universal promise to everyone and everything that God has ever made. See, we talked about the fall last time. We talked about how the intended goodness of creation was broken by a misuse of freedom. In the Bible, evil arises not from the will of God. Evil is not a thing in and of itself. Evil arises from the abuse of freedom. And I think that is a particularly poignant way to understand both evil and freedom in America in 2020. But now God, He saved the world from utter destruction in the flood. The flood is an act of mercy, remember, an act of regeneration, not simply an act of wrath. And now there's still sin in the world. There's still brokenness. And God is playing the long game. This is how he's going to save us all. Through this one old man and his wife, who are so old by the standards of their day that they're as good as dead, according to other parts of the scriptures. So, we continue our story. Let's jump ahead to Genesis 14, verses 14 through 16. And clearly we see now that Abraham has become a very wealthy and powerful guy. God went to Abram, told him to leave his family, leave his home, leave his native country, and wander down into the promised land, what we would call Canaan or Israel. And even though he's left everything behind, even though he's an old man wandering into the desert, he clearly prospers. Not only does he have wealth and herds, but he has fighting men, right? And after we read about the battle in Genesis 14 to 16, we continue on with Genesis 14, 17 to 20. And Abram runs into somebody named Melchizedek. And Melchizedek is the priest king of Salem, a very important, fortified mountain city that we will come to know in later chapters as Jerusalem. And Melchizedek comes out to Abram and says, I'm a servant of the same God who has given his promise to you and called you down into this land. And Melchizedek blesses Abram and gives him bread and wine. This will be important for later in the story, not only because of the role that Jerusalem has to play, but also because of this indication that God is at work in the Gentiles, and he has agents other than just Abram, clearly. And Melchizedek is both priest and king, kind of coming out of nowhere with no given genealogy, blessing the people of Israel and giving them bread and wine. That is going to be an archetype for us, for Christians, of Jesus Christ. Remember what I said? When we read the Old Testament, we as Christians believe that the New Testament is hidden in the Old and the Old is revealed in the New. So we see Jesus in all these stories, even if they're centuries, or in this case, millennia, before Jesus' incarnation in that first blessed Christmas. All right. We then read Genesis chapter 15, the story of God cutting a covenant with Abram. This is the third time that God has reiterated the promise that, of Abram and Sarai. God will make a family, they'll become a people, the people become a nation, the nation will bless everybody. God keeps promising this. But year after year, it hasn't happened. Not yet. Here is God reaffirming this same promise in a very powerful and visceral way. Okay? Abram cuts a series of animals in two and then waits all night, and something like a fire and smoke, which is the presence of God, passes through these severed animal carcasses. What's going on here? We are talking about the Bronze Age, right? This is like I said, more than 4,000 years ago. One of the ways that people would solemnize not a contract, but a covenant. A contract is very specific. You do this, I do that. A covenant is a relationship. In many ways, it's very open-ended. That we're going to be faithful to each other no matter what. This is not necessarily about the specifics. It's about who you and I are to one another. And they didn't have notary publics or anything. The way that they really sealed the pact was they would cut these animals in two and cross between them in order to say, if I break faith with you, if I break covenant with you, may what has happened to these animals happen to me. What is significant here in Genesis 15 is that it isn't Abram who passes through the animals. It is the presence of God. God is the one saying, if I break faith with you, Abraham, may what's happened to these beasts occur to me, occur to Yahweh. All right, now the story continues with the introduction of Hagar and Ishmael. Now, 11 years have passed since we first met Abram at age 75. We continue the story in Genesis 16, 1 to 6, and we run into, again, a lot of uh, mores, traditions that we nowadays would find very offensive. Hagar is the servant or the slave of Sarai. Slavery was sadly universal in pre-modern societies. It's still a lot more widespread today than we would care to admit. Um, Servitude started out as an act of mercy, oddly enough. In war, ancient armies were kind of like the Death Star. There was either don't kill anyone or kill everybody. There's no stun setting on the Death Star. And initially, to take prisoners of war and to make them servants rather than just slit their throats was considered a mercy. You were conserving them, right? The root of conserve is the same as servus, which is servant or slave. So, but at the same time, a lot of these ancient cultures treated their servants as members of the family. Later on, when we get into the talk of slavery in Abraham's descendants, we'll clarify that ancient slavery was not the same thing as the slavery we learn about in the United States with the Civil War and the horrors of racial chattel slavery. Slavery is never a good thing. But lo and behold, Americans were able to take an awful institution and make it so much worse. Go figure. Anyway, if Abram has a child with Hagar, Sarai's handmaiden, then legally that child can be considered Sarai's. It's been 11 years since God promised them a child. And Sarai's losing patience. So she kind of figures out this workaround. Maybe this is how it's going to work. Maybe my husband will have a child with my handmaid. I will raise the child. But God is not going to stomach workarounds. The whole point of God choosing Abram and Sarai, who are Abraham and Sarah, the name gets updated as part of the promise. The whole reason he chooses them is because it's ridiculous. Because they're old. They were considered, walking dead. Because they were infertile. Because their line was done before they were in the ground. In the society of their day, these were non-persons. God chooses them precisely to cut this covenant, to fulfill this promise, to save our world, to show that it's God doing it, right? It would have been an easy enough thing for God to try and save the world through great and powerful emperors, warlords, kings. But to do it through an old homeless guy who he does prosper. I mean, don't get me wrong. The ridiculousness is part of the miracle. It's how you know that God is the one at work behind the scenes. Anyway, we continue the story. Genesis chapter 16, verses 7 through 12 and 15 through 16. Ishmael is the child born to Hagar. And God basically says, no. The promise I made was to Abraham and Sarah. You're trying to cheat. You're trying to get around the weirdness, which is the very point of this promise. Nonetheless, God says that this child Ishmael will be blessed. He's not going to be the one through whom the promise to save all the world, bless all families, will be worked, but he will be a father of many nations as well. So God does not reject Ishmael. God has many blessings to bestow, but Ishmael will not be the one through whom God saves the world. Moving on to Genesis 18, verses 1 through 15. Now it's been 25 years. Abram has gone from 75 to 100, a centenarian, right? This is the famous story of three strangers wandering through the desert, and Abraham shows them the wonderful hospitality which even today marks Bedouin tribes in the Middle East. They show up, and he puts before them bowls of curd. He slaughters a young calf. He brings the meat. He goes above and beyond the call of duty to strangers who have come to his camp, because in the desert, that's what you do. You know very well that if you're on your own in the desert, you're gonna die. And so Abraham welcomes these three, and soon it becomes clear that they aren't just random people. They are messengers of the Lord, angels, divine spirits. And in fact, one of them, in some mysterious way, seems to be the Lord Yahweh himself. And they reiterate the same promise that Abraham and Sarah have heard for 25 years. And they said, by this time next year, Sarah will finally have her baby. And Sarah laughs, just laughs. And who could blame her for doing so? Then we have this interlude, the notorious case of Sodom and Gomorrah. After Abraham has shown these three visitors, angels, spirits of the Lord, hospitality, they say that they're going to go on and see if everything they've heard about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are correct. Sodom and Gomorrah are predatory cities. They do the opposite of what Abraham's done. When strangers come, when weak and vulnerable people come, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah violently abuse and even rape them. It is a complete perversion of Middle Eastern hospitality, indeed of divine love. And apparently, many peoples victimized by Sodom and Gomorrah have lifted their voices to the Lord in protest for justice, for deliverance, and that's what these angels are going to go check out. And as two of the angels go on their way, and the third visitor remains with Abraham, Abraham realizes that this is the Lord, or at least the Lord's mouthpiece, however you want to interpret it. Abraham says, wait a minute, I know what's going to happen here. They're going to go, they're going to see just how bad everybody here is. I mean, my God, raping and murdering and robbing immigrants is about as bad as you can get in the Bible. And Abraham says, hold on, you are the just Lord of all the world. You cannot be unjust. He says, what if you find even 50 people in the city who aren't irredeemably wicked? Would you destroy the city if it meant taking out 50 innocent people? And God says, no, I will not do that. Of course not. And Abraham then continues to press him. He says, okay, don't get upset. What if there's 45 innocent people? 40, 20, 10. And God says, if there are even 10 innocent people in the city, I will not punish the city for the sake of the 10. God does not accept the notion of collateral damage. All right, so Lot and his family. Lot is Abraham's nephew, who's gone his separate way because they were so prosperous they were competing with one another. So they spread out in the land. Lot, his wife, and his two daughters go to Sodom and Gomorrah, and one kindly person welcomes them into his home, and the rest of the city comes to, have their way with the family, as it were. And the angels show up, and they strike everybody blind, and they rescue Lot and his family. 4 people, right? God said, for the sake of 10, I won't destroy the city. Well, there's 4 innocent people that they find, and the angels rescue those 4, get them out of Sodom and Gomorrah before a rain of fire and brimstone comes and wipes their wickedness from the face of the earth, which sounds like some pretty frightening divine wrath, but surely would sound like relief and mercy to those who had been abused and victimized and murdered by the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Last time I taught Old Testament 3 years ago, ISIS was all over the news, and whenever there would be an airstrike against an ISIS camp on the news, nobody went around saying, "Oh, that was unnecessarily violent. No, everybody went around saying, thank God those people aren't around to execute prisoners and slit Christians' throats and set fire to Yazidis and Jews and other minorities who don't fit their understanding of religious purity. No one complains when truly evil people are prevented from being evil. ISIS, Nazis, what have you. We have to keep in mind what is often judgment to one audience is mercy to another. In a violent time, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah that was clearly seen as a good, as just, and indeed as merciful to those who had to live around those wicked cities. And then we get to Genesis 21, verses 1 through 7, which is the birth of Isaac. And Isaac's name, Isaac is the child of Abraham and Sarah, the impossible child of promise, of the old man as good as dead, and the barren woman past her childbearing years. They have a son, and Sarah names him Isaac, which is a play on Sarah laughed, right? Which was the last thing she did when she heard the promise for the umpteenth time after 25 years. Holy Hannah, God has made good. And the plan to save us all is in motion. All right, that is the introduction of Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, and Ishmael. I hope to see you guys Sundays for worship, Wednesdays for Vespers. We're always here for morning prayer, Sunday through Thursday, etc., etc. Have a happy Halloween. Blessed all saints. Go in peace, serve the Lord, and thanks be to God.